Hello and welcome to the Athlete Archives. This is episode 1, The Bird. This is the story of Mark the Bird Fidrych. If you haven't heard of Mark Fidrych, he was a sensational pitcher for a very brief period of time for the Detroit Tigers, starting in 1976. He had a short career in baseball, unfortunately, but he was the rare athlete at the time to cross over from sports into pop culture. He was most famous for the way that he would talk to the ball and wore his emotions on his sleeve. He was very animated as a pitcher and truly one of a kind, and I hope you enjoy his story. Mark grew up about 50 miles west of Boston in a town called Northborough, Massachusetts. He was one of 4 kids. He had 3 sisters. And while Mark demonstrated early that he had athletic ability, he did suffer academically from undiagnosed dyslexia and probably what would be diagnosed as ADD today. So Mark struggled early in school. He ended up repeating the first grade and unfortunately also ended up repeating the second grade. So school was a constant battle for him. But the bright spots were sports and, of course, his family, his dad in particular. Throughout my research, it was mentioned over and over again how involved his dad was in his life, and whether that was playing catch in the yard or coaching his little league team, um, Paul, Mark's dad, was very involved. Mark was a star as a pitcher in American Legion ball. In his first game in 1972, in American Legion, he threw a no-hitter with 14 strikeouts. And as you can probably suspect of a major league player, he was the ace of his high school pitching staff. His first high school start, he had 13 strikeouts, and in his second high school start, he had 17 strikeouts. He pitched 53 innings in high school before giving up a single run. So he was pretty dominant, but unfortunately for Mark, the team couldn't really field or hit. And his first year, he had an incredible 0.029 ERA, but had a 4-3 record. One interesting game in Legion Ball, he went up against another soon-to-be professional baseball player, Stan Zaleski. Stan never made it to the MLB level, but he did play minor league baseball. And in this face-off, this American Legion face-off, each pitcher had thrown 12 innings of no-hit ball. 12 innings in high school. Mark ended up winning that game in 13, but because he had been held back twice after his sophomore year in high school, he wasn't eligible to pitch in the public school system. So he transferred to a private school in Worcester where he could continue playing. Now, this was no church school. They played against small colleges and JV teams from schools like UMass and Dartmouth and Brown. So they were playing tough competition. And Mark threw a 3-hitter complete game against the Dartmouth JV team, but lost. He had hoped that he would get college offers from being exposed in these college JV games, but that didn't happen. His coach eventually got him a walk-on spot at Old Dominion, which, as a side note, another former great Tiger pitcher played at Old Dominion, Justin Verlander. But unfortunately, Mark couldn't score high enough on the SAT to get into Old Dominion. So he resigned himself to going to work, which is not a terrible thing for somebody who really hated school anyways. If baseball wasn't an option, working at the gas station was just fine with Mark. And that's exactly what he was doing when the Tigers drafted him in the 1974 MLB draft. Round 10, 232nd pick overall. Mark didn't even know. In fact, he didn't even know that the draft was happening. He was just totally unplugged. There had been no communication from anybody in MLB, no scouts. He had no idea that there was any interest at all. So he was pumping gas at the gas station when a friend rolled up and yelled out of the car, "Mark, you were drafted!" And Mark's heart sank. So again, this is 1974, and Mark had assumed that he had been drafted for the Vietnam War. So you can imagine he was not exactly thrilled about that news. But then, literally minutes later, his dad drove up and kind of sorted it out, and they were just thrilled. They were excited. His days of pumping gas were over. Mark was going to get to go play sports for a living. So he and his dad were obviously very excited. They were waiting at the door when the contract arrived, and Mark signed it immediately, no negotiation. And he got his $3,000 signing bonus, and he was on his way. He spent 2 years in the minor leagues, 1974 and 1975. In 1974, he joined the Tigers in the Bristol Rookie League in Lakeland. And it didn't take long for Mark to make an impression, and he got bumped to Double-A Montgomery, and then finally to Triple-A Evansville Triplets. He didn't spend much time there. He pitched just a few games at Double-A, and then he quickly rose to be the #1 starter in Evansville. And he finished the season there with a 4-1 record and a 1.58 ERA. So obviously he was ready, and it wasn't a shock that he stood a good chance to make the big league club in 1976. And it also appears that Evansville is where Mark first hooked up with his longtime battery mate, Bruce Kim. So let's talk about 1976. The Tigers manager in 1976 was Ralph Houck. Houck had spent 11 years as manager of the Yankees before coming to Detroit. Before Ralph Houck managed the Yankees, they were led by Casey Stengel. Stengel had frustrated Hall of Famer Whitey Ford by limiting his innings. If you look at Whitey Ford's statistics on Baseball Reference, you'll see that he never won 20 games under Casey Stengel. And as soon as Ralph Houck came, he did. So when Ralph Houck became manager, he made it clear that he wasn't going to baby pitchers. There were no innings limits. And that first year under Houck, Whitey Ford ended up throwing 283 innings and winning 25 games. The year before under Casey Stengel, he only threw 192. So if you're not well versed in pitching stats, 283 is a ton, in today's game at least. This is to say that Ralph Houck did not believe in innings limits, and as you'll find out, I don't think that that was really a good thing for Mark. The Tigers, well, they were a bad team. They were a mess in the mid-1970s. They were a sub-500 team 2 years prior to Ralph Houck getting there, and in 1976 they got off to a typical bad start. Mark finally made his debut April 20th in relief. And I only mention it because in this case, or in that game, the starting catcher broke his ankle. And what that meant was that Bruce Kim, Mark's buddy from AAA, was getting called up. So Mark made a couple of relief appearances and pitched in an exhibition game, which is something they used to do during the season. They don't do that anymore. And finally, on May 15th, he got his first start in Detroit against the Cleveland Indians. Some of the Indians players were not thrilled with the way that Mark acted on the mound. They were kind of put off, and there was a quote that they thought he was being a wise guy, talking to the ball, erratic arm motions, and the way he would get on all fours and manicure the mound, and so on. But they quickly learned that the kid could pitch. And the Indians did not get a runner to first until they drew a walk in the 5th inning, and then Buddy Bell singled in the 7th for the first hit. Mark ended up finishing his very first start with a complete game, 2-hitter, and first major league win. The Detroit Free Press ran a photo of Mark aiming the ball and a story about the new pitcher who talks to the ball. As fortune would have it for Mark, his second start would be in Boston, only 40 minutes from his hometown. Mark had told a reporter before the game that he wasn't nervous. It was going to be fun. And it was. Mark threw a complete game against Boston, but lost 2-0. So 2 starts, 2 complete games. And again, I know this was a different era, but 12 of Mark's first 13 starts were complete games, and 2 of those were 11-inning complete games. And I'm injecting my own opinion here with respect to innings and pitch counts. And there are people on both sides of the debate about whether innings limits or pitch counts make sense. Some people think that today's prevalence of arm injuries is more due to the pitch being thrown, like sliders, which is a pitch that Mark threw, or if it's just the gross number of pitches being thrown. I don't know, but during this crazy stretch of complete games from May 15th to July 20th, Bird Mania took over. And at first it was regional, but things exploded when the Yankees came to Detroit for a nationally televised game, Monday Night Baseball, June 28th. And if you weren't alive in the 1970s, it might be hard to imagine how important Monday Night Baseball was. Similar to how Monday Night Football is today, it was the showcase game of the week. And remember, back then we had 3 channels, and they were local channels. Like you got your local team, and that was it. So only on this one night of the week would you see somebody from outside of your local area. So odds were that on Monday night, June 28th, 1976, if you had the TV on and you were even remotely a sports fan, you had the TV tuned to NBC and you had this game on. This game is on YouTube. I was able to find it and I watched it. It was 1 hour and 51 minutes from start to finish, including commercials. So it didn't take long. It was estimated that as many as 10,000 fans were left outside in the streets, unable to get tickets on a Monday night for a losing sub 500 team. The broadcast booth, which included Warner Wolf and the legendary, lovely guy Bob Uecker, they were getting a huge kick out of it, and the fans were cheering every little out. Heading into the ninth with a 5-1 lead, 50,000 fans are on their feet, and Mark finished the game. The Tigers win. By teammate Rusty Staub's account, this may have been the origin of the post-game curtain call. Mark was in the clubhouse with his shirt off, and the fans were screaming for him, and Rusty was kind of prodding him to go out there, and Mark, he was too shy. He didn't want to go, and he asked Rusty, come with me, and Rusty said, do you hear that? We want the bird, not we want Rusty. So he managed to get him out there, and that is on the YouTube video as well. You'll see the excitement and how honored Mark was. It's pretty cool. Rusty was quoted as saying, "It was electrifying for me to watch that happen to him. It was more electrifying than if it happened to me because I appreciated something that was new and great in the game. I saw Sandy Koufax, and he was pretty exciting, but nothing like this guy. There was nobody like Mark Fidrych." Overnight, Mark became a national star. Sports Illustrated published a feature on him, Baseball Digest, and the Sporting News. But then, as I said, he crossed over into popular culture. People magazine sent a reporter to Mark's apartment, and the interviewer was impressed with how clean everything was. And Mark had made the comment that sometimes he'd let the dishes stack up, but they didn't stack too high because he only had 4. So the public ate it up, and everybody wanted to know what was Mark saying to the ball when he pitched. And he was quoted as saying, "I say to the ball, ball, you curve. And if it doesn't curve, I say nasty things when the catcher throws it back." And the reporter said, "Does the ball ever talk back to you?" And Mark said, the only time the ball talks back is when it's going over the fence and it says, "You shouldn't have thrown that pitch." So he was having fun with it, and there was an article published by the Associated Press with the headline, "Detroit hero Fidrych does it all for $16,500 a year." The article mentioned that Mark was stressing over answering fan mail because he couldn't afford the stamps. So a grassroots campaign called Bucks for the Bird was started, where people were mailing him $1 and $2 checks. Can you imagine today writing a check to a Major League Baseball player for $1? Mark didn't cash any of those checks, but the gesture spoke loudly, and people loved him. The next start for Mark was in Baltimore, and they had a sellout crowd. And the only reason I mention it was because Orioles pitcher Mike Cuellar was quoted in the press saying that he tried talking to the baseball, but he says, quote, "I speak Spanish and the ball is American." So Mark won the American League Player of the Month in June with a 6-0 record and a 2.18 ERA to lead the league. And he was named to the All-Star game and actually got the start for the American League. At the midway point of the season, the Bird had a 9-2 record and a ridiculous 1.17 ERA with 10 complete games. Detroit opened the second half of the season with Mark throwing unbelievably his third 11-inning complete game. I won't keep going game by game, but I wanted to throw some stats at you. He finished his rookie season with 250 and one-third innings. In any event, Mark's 1976 ERA finished at 2.34 with a 1.07 whip, which is amazing. He pitched 23 ninth innings. As I said, he had 24 complete games, but one of those, he only pitched 8 innings because the Tigers lost. But in those 23 ninth innings, he gave up 1 run. 13 of his starts, this is ridiculous. 13 of his starts, he pitched on 3 days of rest. That would be considered downright abuse today. 5 days rest is standard. Everybody wanted a piece of the Bird. He was shooting commercials. He was invited backstage to meet Elton John. Frank Sinatra famously had a birthday party, and he invited the Bird. And there were musicians and actors there, but reportedly Frank spent the whole night talking to Mark. Mark was invited to be on Bill Cosby's show, and Bill Cosby was just huge in the 1970s and 80s. They gave him lines to read on the Bill Cosby show, but he kept botching it because of his dyslexia. He was invited to be on the show of all shows back then, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. But he had to turn that one down. He also turned down Dinah Shore, Mary Tyler Moore, and Good Morning America. I'd read that the movie Grease was being filmed at this time, and the producer wanted Mark for a supporting role or cameo role, and he had to decline that also. He was, after all, pitching every 3 days. So Mark ended up winning Rookie of the Year in 1976, which is rarely an award given to pitchers. Pitchers kind of have their own award with the Cy Young. So for a pitcher to win Rookie of the Year, it takes something pretty special. So now we roll into spring training 1977, and there's tremendous excitement and hope heading into the season. But the tide turned on March 21st. Mark was in the outfield in Lakeland, shagging fly balls and running all over the place like a kid, and Rusty Staub pulled him aside and basically said, "Listen, kid, we have 2 weeks left of spring training. Slow down." Literally minutes later, Mark ran and jumped to catch a fly ball and landed awkwardly and started limping. And the short of it is that he tore cartilage in his knee and needed surgery. So, not the worst outcome. It wasn't his arm, but he wasn't going to be able to throw while his knee was being rehabbed. So the plan was for Mark to make his debut in early June. Now, today, when somebody's injured and they can't throw, the way a team would handle it is there would be a progression. They would have a throwing program. They'd be doing long toss, throwing on flat ground, mixing in bullpen sessions, and then the pitcher would eventually progress, probably make a minor league start to pitch in a live game. There's a whole process to getting back on the mound in the major leagues. But this was 1977, and men were men, and Mark made no appearances in minor league ball, and I found no reference at all to any kind of throwing program. They, in fact, brought him back early, and he made a start in early May. So how could we make this even dumber? How about leave him out there for the full 9 innings, his first start back? That's exactly what the Tigers did, even though they were losing the game. He went right into the rotation, and he pitched 6 complete games in the next 7. Rusty Staub was not happy about it. He was vocal, and he thought that the club should be taking it slower with Mark. But as June rolled around, Rusty started to look like a fool because Mark was on fire, and Rusty started to second guess himself. Until July 4th in a game at Baltimore when the wheels unfortunately fell off. Dave Rozema, the Tiger pitcher, was quoted as saying he was watching the game from the dugout and he saw Mark throw a pitch and he thought, that does not look right. His motion looked different, his velo was down, and Mark got the hook in the 6th inning. He later told his catcher, Bruce Kim, "Bruce, my arm is killing me." Unfortunately, Mark did not tell his manager, Ralph Houck, and on 3 days' rest, he got the ball again. He gave up 11 hits in 5 innings and got the hook. Still, no team doctors took a look. Nobody looked into him, and Mark is obviously to blame. He didn't raise any red flags. Athletes do this all the time, though. 3 days later, he's out there again. This time he got 2 outs in the 1st inning, and he called Ralph Houck out to the mound. He was in too much pain, and he could not pitch. He ended up not pitching again that season. He bounced from doctor to doctor. He was resting, rehabbing, and still pain. Finally, Patrick Zier ran a series of articles calling out Tiger mismanagement of their pitchers. Vern Rule, Dave Rozema, and Jack Morris all had various arm pain and injuries, like Mark did under Ralph Houck. 30 years after the fact, Ralph Houck was still adamant that Mark was not mismanaged. And I get it. I mean, Ralph, his whole philosophy was to not limit pitches. And I'm sure that he didn't want to injure Mark. But in any case, 1977 was over, and Mark would try to start fresh again in 1978. And spring training started out well. In 1978, he had a 0.6 ERA, and he got the ball for opening day, which is a huge honor for a pitcher. And he pitched well in the season opener. And I'm sure you'll be shocked to know that he pitched a complete game. 4 days later, he was back on the mound at Arlington against the Rangers, where he dominated in another 9-inning complete game. So 2 games into the season, Mark's ERA was 2 with a whip under 1, and the bird was back, baby. Or was he? In his 3rd and, spoiler alert, his last start of 1978, he threw 40 pitches and then he took himself out of the game with shoulder pain. Rest wasn't helping and doctors weren't helping. Mark went down to Lakeland to work with Jimmy Leland, trying to ease back into throwing. He was diagnosed as having tendonitis, but the pain would never go away. And going into 1979, the Tigers had a new manager. Ralph Houck had resigned after 1978, and Les Moss was promoted from within. Mark continued to push himself, and he made some progress. He made his season debut against the Twins in '79, but he only went 4 innings, and he was not himself. He would end the season in May with only 14 2/3 of an inning pitched, with an ERA over 10. Things never really got better for him. He returned at the end of the 1980 season, and he lasted a little bit longer. He threw 44 innings that year, but he just wasn't the same guy. His ERA was over 5, and his velo just continued to go down. At the end of the 1980 season, the Tigers opted not to re-sign Mark Fidrych. But Mark refused to give up. He was able to sign a minor league contract with his home team, Boston. He was hugely popular still, especially in Boston. And when he pitched for Pawtucket in his first minor league start, the house was packed. 9,389 fans in a stadium with a max capacity of 5,800. It was the largest crowd in the history of that stadium. He continued to battle and he pitched for another couple of years through pain, and he finally hung it up in 1983. And in 1985, Mark was finally diagnosed with a torn rotator cuff. That was it the whole time. So simple. It was a diagnosis by Dr. James Andrews, the famous Tommy John surgeon, that basically anybody in MLB today who tears their UCL goes to Dr. James Andrews. Unfortunately for Mark, had this been torn today, his rotator cuff, it would be a simple surgery and he'd be back pitching in under a year. It's just unfortunate for him. But finally, Mark could use his right arm to open doors again without pain. It's a shame, really, that medicine failed him. Either it wasn't advanced enough at the time to diagnose, or the doctors were incompetent. Um, but we just don't know how Mark's career could have played out. Fortunately for Mark, he was frugal as a player and saved his money. And he ended up buying a 123-acre farm in his hometown of Northborough. And he ended up marrying his wife Anne in 1986, and they had a baby girl, Jessica, in 1987. Mark loved being a father and a farmer, and what he really loved was his Mack dump truck that he bought when he started a hauling business. He worked construction, hauling asphalt and gravel and building roads and driveways. And I saw an interview with him where he said that the closest feeling he got to being on the major league mound was behind the wheel of that Mack truck. So he found happiness and he loved what he was doing. He loved the farm and he loved his family. And just as Mark's dad was his coach, Mark was Jessica's coach for her sports growing up. So he was very hands on with his family, and he spent a lot of time volunteering, visiting schools, and sharing his story. He actually came to my high school in the late 1980s, and he had an impression on me. His passion was serving disabled children, and notably the Special Olympics. On Monday, on Monday, April 13th, 2009, the day after Easter, Mark headed out to a construction site for work, but the site wasn't ready, so he turned around and headed home to do some maintenance work on his truck. I remember hearing about Mark's death, but I remember hearing that he had been crushed while working under a car. And apparently, a lot of people believed that. It's a common misunderstanding. So I'm betting that some initial news report probably got the facts wrong, and that's what most of us remember. But in fact, the police report from that day said that Mark's clothing got caught in the truck's PTO. And if you're not aware, a PTO is a power takeoff. It's a spinning shaft used to power accessories on a truck. Probably on Mark's truck, it was used to operate the dumping mechanism. In any case, spinning machinery is dangerous, and it caught his clothing and ended up killing him. And I'll say, we all make mistakes, and most of us are fortunate enough where we aren't in situations where our mistakes can cost us our lives. Mark paid the ultimate price. He was 54 years old, and after Mark's death, he was inducted into the Polish American Sports Hall of Fame. In June of 2009, his daughter Jessica threw out the first pitch when he was honored at Comerica Park. ESPN aired a 45-minute documentary about the bird that you can see on YouTube. It's really good. If you listen to this podcast or this YouTube video this far, I think you would find it worthwhile. I'll include all of the references that I used putting together this video. I do want to specifically mention Doug Wilson's book on the bird. It was an invaluable resource. If you like to read, I really encourage you to check that out. Also, as I mentioned, that Monday night baseball game is available online. That's kind of cool to watch. A lot of newspaper articles, old newspaper articles, have been scanned in, and you can find those sometimes on archive.org, I believe. That kind of stuff used to be on microfiche when I was a kid. I don't even know if that exists anymore in libraries. But I hope that you enjoyed the story of Mark Fidrych. He had a lasting impression on me when I was a kid, and I hope you learned something about him and his life. I do feel bad for him that he was really let down by the medical profession, both with his undiagnosed dyslexia and then later with the undiagnosed torn rotator cuff. But he was a happy guy. He had a great family, and he was very involved with his family. And I'm not sure that we can ask for anything more than that. What an incredible story. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you check out episode 2, which is going to be on another very unique baseball player, Mo Berg. Thank you and take care.